Hello, everyone. I'm delighted today to be talking with Dr. Sanjay Baru, who at various times has been a journalist, a policy advisor. He was the media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, an author, an academic, multiple hats. Today, we'll be talking about this book, India's Power Elite, which is a fascinating insight into the undergoings that the India's elite is, the transformations that the India's elite is undergoing right now. He's also the author of The Accidental Prime Minister, which we may touch at the moment as we in the context of this book. Dr. Baru, great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, Amish.
I want to start this conversation by you giving us an insight into the history of India's elites, because you talk about the transformation that India's elite has underwent before independence and in the immediate aftermath of independence, from feudalism to the Lutyens Delhi as it is. So could you provide us a brief overview of that?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, India is, ancient civilization. So we've had elites over the centuries, like in many other old societies. But I think what is fascinating about India and what in some ways marks India apart from many other societies in the world is the rigidity in the structure of elite formation, particularly due to the caste system. I mean, we've had this upper caste, middle caste, lower caste division between the Brahmins, the landed aristocracies, the trading communities, the money lending communities, the peasant communities, and then the working class, the tribals, those who are outside of the caste system. This structure has been there for hundreds of years, probably a couple of thousand years, if not more. So therefore, there is a long enduring structure which underpins the current modern, social structure in India. And I don't go into the history of India's, social structure. I begin by making two observations, which in fact I draw inspiration from the work of Raman or Loya, a socialist leader, who defined India's power elite in a essay that he wrote in the 1950s, the post-independence power elite, in terms of three components of its constitution. First, he said they're English-speaking. Second, they're upper caste. And third, they've inherited wealth. And I think that's a good starting point. It is true that the elite of the colonial era that India inherited as a free nation in 1947 was largely English speaking. Most of them, incidentally, and we should remember this, were bilingual. For example, my maternal grandfather was in the Indian Civil Service, the ICS. He went and studied at the University of Cambridge in the 1920s. He was as proficient in the English language as he was in Telugu. He wrote extensively in Telugu. And that would be true of almost all parts of the country: Bengalis, Malayalis, Tamils, Hindi-speaking people, Punjabis, that they would be as fluent in English as they would be in their mother tongue. But English was an important defining element of elitism at that point in time. A second feature, which is exactly what I mentioned, is the caste system, that the elite were upper caste. Therefore, they were either Brahmins or they were Kshatriyas or Vaishyas, who were the three major elements of the upper caste. The Kshatriya being essentially landowning or aristocracy, the military aristocracy, etc. And Vaishyas being merchants, traders, business communities. And of course, the Brahmins were the priest class, those who interpreted the classics, the religious texts, etc., and offered prayers at temples. And the third element, according to Raman or Loya, of the elites at that point in time was that they had inherited wealth. And this is also interesting because the main source of wealth was land or knowledge as inherited. Brahmins inherited this one generation. So that's the structure of the Indian elites that was, I think, aptly described by Lohia. And I take that as a starting point in my book and try to look at how this has changed over the last 70 years.
You make a distinction between rural elites versus urban elites. So some of the components uh, work for the urban elites, but they don't work for the rural elites, in particular English language. So would you say the rural elite is new, or has it always been there but is gaining more traction now?
No, in fact, if you go back in time, even the rural elites would have been familiar with the English language. It is not as if, unlike what we think of today, the peasantry that operate mainly in the vernacular or the mother tongue. This would not have been necessarily true in British India. Even if you're a landlord, you would invariably have gone to school, if not in your own village or in your region, you would have been sent off to a boarding school. In fact, the school I went to in Hyderabad, which is now called the Hyderabad Public School, was originally called the Jagirdars College. And it was actually set up for children of landowners, Jagirdars being the landowners. So the rural elite, even then, would have been English speaking. Of course, in a place like Hyderabad, they would have been Urdu speaking because that was the official language. But in British India, they would certainly have an English speaking.
The first elites which came with Prime Minister Nehru, and they were institutionalized by Indira Gandhi. So how did the entrenchment of elites, certain elites into the institutions happen in the initial years of post-independence?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about India, and I mentioned this in my book, but this is something that many social scientists have written about over the years, is the nature of the transition. I mean, unlike in the case of, let's say, the Soviet Union or China or even earlier France, where the elites were virtually physically eliminated but before new elites came into power. India saw a gradual transition. I think there's a classic book called The Gradual Revolution, which was describing of the Indian transition. And what that meant was that in almost all institutions, the transition was quite unbloodied. I mean, you take, for example, the Congress Party itself, which was the instrument of change. It began as essentially a association of very anglicized Indians, many of them Westerners, many Englishmen, many Europeans who felt that the voice of the local people ought to be heard, and were influenced by the emergence of liberalism and democratic ideas in Europe and in England in particular. And then the Congress Party became the institution of change, or the instrument of change. So unlike in, let's say, in the Soviet Union, where the Communist Party virtually eliminated the Tsarist elite, in India, the elite that were dominant in British India continued. I mean, Nehru himself is a classic example. His father was a very successful lawyer, a very rich man of Allahabad. Nehru himself went to Harrow and Cambridge, etc. But then they became the leaders of the national movement. And that's true of all the institutions, the armed forces, the Indian civil service, which then became the Indian administrative service, the Indian police, which became the Indian police service. So the smooth transition of all these institutions meant that the elites were very much in place. Probably a thin top layer, what you might call a creamy layer, if you like, may have been displaced, particularly those who went away to England. But of those who stayed back, many of them continued. And incidentally, what is interesting is that till 1969, when Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, abolished privy purses and feudal titles, all the feudal elite retained their titles. I mean, the Maharaja of Sindhya, and I mentioned this in the book, what was his original title? It
Yeah.
was such a long, lengthy name, going over 3 or 4 lines of a book. All of them retained their very elaborate titles even after independence. It was only in '69 that Mrs. Gandhi, in her socialist phase, abolished the use of the titles. Though I must say, add here that in recent months we see a resurgence of the use of these titles. Recently, I saw some invitation to a book function in New Delhi that referred to Jyotiraditya Scindia's son as Maharaj. So some of these characters are once again, using these old titles.
It's also, you also mentioned that, the father of Jyotiraditya Scindia, Madhavrao Scindia, didn't necessarily mind the fact that, he was called the Maharaja, and the road that's named after him has his title in.
That's right. I mean, not only did not mind, I think they would insist, particularly among their own constituents. I mean, if you went to Gwalior, if you went to Guna, from where Jyotiraditya was elected, and if you went to the places from where they came, they continued to refer to them as Maharaj or Samant. These are all titles. It's only in Delhi that they all became, wearing jeans and attending parties, and everybody said, "Hi, Jyoti," and nobody referred to him as "Hello, Your Highness." But these guys, they're quite happy to be referred to with their titles.
This also exposes the cracks that we find in the elites. And you write about this in the context of the Nehru Memorial Museum, what happened under Vidula Mukherjee's term, when liberal, even left-wing academics were very critical of it being transformed into essentially a party uh, site. So what we're witnessing today, the transformation of that institution into, say, the Prime Minister's Memorial Museum and Library, is partly because of the history that the other government did. It's in reaction to that. So
Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
so could you elaborate on that and also talk about, because there's also the ICHR, Ram Goa has repeatedly written about how the ICHR was captured by Marxist leftist historian as a kind of propaganda tool.
Sure. Well, I mean, in any society, at any given point of time, those who are in power, culturally, politically, economically, tend to dominate institutions. So I don't think that's unique to India. That would be true in any country, any even a liberal democracy in the West. You would see that there are certain elements that tend to dominate. So, for example, in the United States, as the kind of Democratic influence goes down and Republican Party influence goes up, you find that reflected in the think tanks and various institutions, in the judiciary also, for example. But on the specific question of the Nehru Memorial Museum, I refer to it because, it captures the kind of change. It is true that it was set up as a tribute to Nehru, and there were good reasons. I mean, many countries in the world have paid tribute to the founding leadership of their nations. After all, Washington, D.C. is named after George Washington, the first president of the United States. Delhi remains Delhi, but, the large parts of India where Nehru is memorialized. And that there was a museum from that is the home in which he lived was converted into a museum, I think was a natural kind of development. I would not have criticized that decision at that point in time. Well, I think at the end of 75 years, if the current government felt that we need to memorialize other leaders as well, that's fine. But I think the point I refer to when I look at the Nehru Memorial Museum incident is one, the degeneration of that institution, the management of that institution, particularly during Mridula Mukherjee's time, when it became really a family kind of dominated organization. And I think the professionalism with which it was originally built up, and I had some familiarity with the institution because I wrote large parts of my own PhD thesis sitting in the Nehru Memorial Museum. When the director was someone like historian Ravinder Kumar, a highly respected liberal historian, not at all a Marxist or not someone who was beholden to the Gandhi family. And Ravinder Kumar ran the institution as a very professional academic institution. But I think under Mridula Mukherjee's leadership, it degenerated and therefore created the basis for its further transformation and its further politicization by the current regime, which has virtually, they replaced chaps who were close to the Gandhi family, whether it was a Jairam Ramesh or Mridula Mukherjee, with a Swapan Das Gupta or an M.J. Akbar, so that is a good example of, the transition within the elite from the pre-Modi era to the Modi era.
But with those examples, because previously there used to be that one set of friends would go in and another set of friends would go out. Uh, and has it changed really? Because you mentioned Swapan Das Gupta and MJ Akbar. These are not new elites. These are part of the old elites who just share different views, but they move in the same circles.
Yes, I mean, I think that was there. I mean, in some senses, I think MJ is already out of that circuit, and new names are coming in. I mean, we'll find very new names who are not part of the old elite, who are now, getting into the various institutions. But I think they were part of the transition. And again, it's been a very interesting. I mean, just like from the British Raj to the Nehru era, you had a smooth transition. From the pre-Modi to the Modi era, we are getting a smooth transition. Slowly, people are being put into various institutions and positions, pursuing the Hindutva agenda. And one by one, they're taking steps to create this new elite. I mean, you take another classic institution of elitism in India, which is the literary festivals. When the Jaipur Literature Festival was first started, the whole format of the literature festival, the kind of people associated with it, etc., etc. I mean, this was classic Delhi elites, or Lutyens elite, as they would be called. And now you have parallel, Hindutva festivals. I mean, in Pondicherry, for example, the pro-BJP chaps have started staging an annual book literature festival where they invite only people who are sympathetic, if not fully supported, but certainly sympathetic to the current regime in Delhi. So you see the format of a book festival, of a book literature festival remains, but the ideology that underpins that event is slowly taken over from liberal to saffronite elements.
The seeds of this transformation was sown in under Dr. Singh's term, where you were the media advisor. And your book, which I read, The Accidental Prime Minister, a few years ago, was a fascinating look into the way in which the Darbar works, along with Tavleen Singh's works. So I would be interested to know, how do you think that there was during Dr. Singh's term, at least in the second term, was there a shadow elite, perhaps in the guise of the NAC, which was controlling the government? Did Dr. Singh lose control?
Well, I mean, the second term, yes, I mean, that's what I've recorded in my book. I think he began to lose control precisely because of the attempt to somehow bring in Rahul Gandhi at that time. I mean, much water has flown down the Ganga since then. So, we are now dealing with a very different set of circumstances. But I think the larger point I would make about the Manmohan Singh era is that to understand the nature of transition in India, it's important to remember that the Nehruvian era, if you like, the dominance of the family, ended actually in 1989 when Rajiv Gandhi's term ended. VP Singh became the Prime Minister. And then you see VP Singh, Chandrasekhar, and then Narasimha Rao comes to power and asserts himself. And then you have Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who is from the BJP. So you actually see a transition, gradual transition happening. I think even through the first term of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh from 2004 to 2008, 2009, despite the National Advisory Council being there, the family itself was in the shadows. I mean, we all knew that they had a tremendous influence, and that's what I've recorded in my book. But they're still in the shadows. I think what happened in the second term was a deliberate attempt to try and come back, to back in power. And when I say the family, I mean all the entire the mafia, if you like, the darbar, that went along with that. I mean, all the chaps in the media, in the bureaucracy, in the cultural world, and so on and so forth, who were part of that earlier era and who saw their own position being whittled down, starting with Narasimha Rao, then certainly during Vajpayee's time, and in the initial years of Manmohan Singh. There was a reassertion of that. And the reassertion had two objectives. The one objective was, in some senses, to erase the influence of the Hindutva kind of ideology that had already begun to creep in during Vajpayee's period, though in a very soft and subtle way. But I think the more important objective during that period was to try and install Rahul Gandhi. And I think they failed in achieving both those objectives. And then we had Narendra Modi. So the Manmohan Singh's second term, I think, created political conditions for the kind of change we have seen after 2014.
But it's also true that the reason that Rahul Gandhi did not come into power is because Dr. Singh did not resign despite tremendous pressure. So do you think he was exercising his agency as it was to not let someone inexperienced and who has never been in a cabinet position of power become the prime minister?
I'm not so sure. I mean, this is a difficult question to answer. To what extent was it that Manmohan Singh refused to move out and install Rahul? Or to what extent was it that if Manmohan Singh had moved out, it may well have been that Pranab Mukherjee would have moved in rather than Rahul. And at least till 2012, that was certainly a possibility. The fact is that between 2004 and 2012, which is 8 years of the 10 years, if Dr. Singh had actually stepped down, as it did indeed threaten to at the time of the nuclear deal, but subsequently there were demands for him to step down from various quarters. If he did that, I think the person who would have staked his claim would have been Pranab Mukherjee. I think in 2012, Pranab Mukherjee probably realized that now it's too late. Anyway, there are only 2 more years to go, and probably felt that look, there's no way there would be a transition now, and chose to offer himself up for the presidentship and became president. But till 2012, when he became president, Pranab Mukherjee was always there. And Mrs. Gandhi would simply not want Manmohan Singh to be replaced by Pranab Mukherjee. That is now well known. There's a lot of evidence. Many people have written. There was no way in which Pranab Mukherjee could have become prime minister with the party in the control of the Gandhi family.
I want to take a little detour because recently, I think yesterday, Mani Shankar Iyer made a statement that PV Narasimha Rao was actually a BJP prime minister. So, given that you've worked with Dr. Manmohan Singh and you know the kind of respect that he has for PV Narasimha Rao, how do you look at his prime ministership and do you think this is again the old elite trying to strike back?
Well, I mean, Mani Shankar Iyer is a maverick. He's a jack in the box. And I'm looking forward to reading his book because he's an entertaining writer. Certainly an entertaining individual. But I don't think a large majority in the Congress party itself would agree with him. There is there is a group within the Congress party, certainly an influential group, that has always taken this view. In fact, many of them challenged Narasimha Rao, like Arjun Singh and N.D. Tiwari, etc., who are the kind of people that Mani Shankar, he reflects their views. And the view was that Narasimha Rao did not manage the Babri Masjid demolition correctly because he was a closet BJP. Now, the fact is that here is a man who spent his entire life in the Congress party. And the Congress party had many people who, were Hindu in their intellectual orientation. Even during the national movement. I mean, it's not as if everybody in the Congress party was a leftist or was a, purely secular in a Western sense. Many of the leaders of the Congress party were Hindus. And certainly it was Rajiv Gandhi who actually did the Shilanyas, and it was during his term that the whole Babri Masjid issue came to the fore. So to single out Narasimha Rao, I think, is churlish, and money has been churlish. And moreover, to use only that one incident of the Babri Masjid to characterize the politics of Narasimha Rao is fundamentally flawed. It is fundamentally flawed for two very important reasons, or at least three very important reasons. The first reason is that of all the provincial Congress leaders of the last 75 years, the one person who tried to implement land reforms, which was a left-wing agenda in the Congress party, a communist agenda in the Congress party, was Narasimha Rao in Andhra Pradesh, United Andhra Pradesh. In fact, one of the reasons he was finally removed from his job as chief minister was because the landed aristocracy of Andhra Pradesh revolted against it, because he actually took away land from the Reddys, the Velamas, the Kammas, the landowning upper caste, and tried to redistribute them. So land reform, which is a very left-wing agenda, was something that people associate with Narasimha Rao. The second thing one associates with Narasimha Rao is a very Nehruvian foreign policy. As a foreign minister of Indira Gandhi, he implemented a foreign policy that was certainly very Nehruvian, even during Rajiv Gandhi's time, and then as prime minister. Finally, his most important contribution as prime minister was India's economic policy, economic liberalization, trade and industrial policy liberalization. And Jairam Ramesh, who is now a very senior leader of the Congress party, has a book called To the Brink and Back. I have some differences with his interpretation of events, but I certainly think that Jairam's book represents what I would call the Rajiv Gandhi group view. And there Jairam says that whatever Narasimha Rao did, in fact, whatever Manmohan Singh did, was all the agenda that Rajiv had, written down, crossed the T's and dotted the I's, and it was all written policy. It was there to be implemented. And these two gentlemen, Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, only implemented a policy of Rajiv Gandhi. So, for money to kind of ignore all these aspects and say this headline-grabbing statement that he was the first BJP prime minister, it'll help him sell his book, I'm sure. But I don't think it's makes much sense.
But he's known for that, so he makes these remarks often. Uh, I want to place the elite conversation in the larger context of the world politics. Because Michael Sandel has a recent book out. I think it's called The Tyranny of Meritocracy, where he argues that the reason right-wing populism is rising in the world, Trump or Orban or all of these figures, is because the the neoliberals and the liberals has lost the narrative on meritocracy, because they have pretended that there is a meritocracy when there's not, when clearly the working class is facing issues, when there is, there's talks about Donald Trump's supporters being a basket of deplorables, for instance, or about his lack of education, his lack of refinement. And we see the same conversation in the context of Modi's degrees. So do you think these issues actually help the people identify more with the prime minister and so vote more for him because because they look up to him as one of them, as someone who's not maybe as well educated as the old elites, as the Lutyens did?
Well, this is first of all a difficult question to answer, and any answer would be a very complicated one. There are many fault lines in what we see today. So to look for a single fault line, I think would be simplistic. Um, my own view is that rather than use the word meritocracy, I would say that part of the problem of right-wing politics, and this is not the first time, you go back to the 1930s when right-wing politics was in the ascendance in Europe particularly, is the fact that social inequalities, cultural inequalities, economic inequalities have increased. And whenever inequalities increase, there is disaffection among the underprivileged, the dispossessed. And the elites have always used some ideology or another in order to blunt the sharp edge of disaffection. So one of the points I end my book by saying is the rise of religion in Indian politics a manifestation of the failure of the Indian elite to ensure adequate economic development and a redistributive development process? The failure of development, that the rich have become richer, even if the poor have not become poorer, and therefore inequalities have increased, which is something that Thomas Piketty has written about in the context of Europe and the West. And we know that around the world inequalities have increased over the last quarter century. Inequalities between nations have increased. And whenever such inequalities increase, those who are the privileged, who are the beneficiaries of the current regime, try to divert attention away from themselves. So you say, oh, go after the Muslims, like Hitler said, go after the Jews, because I don't have a solution to your problem of unemployment, underemployment, malnutrition, poverty, etc., etc. So let's find a target, and social targets are found. So whether it's Trump in the United States or Modi in India or the new political elites of Europe, in Italy, in Poland, in UK, they are all trying to divert the attention of the underprivileged, the dispossessed, away from the fact that it is the nature of the development process in their societies. And interesting, in some ways, this is happening even in China. I mean, the rise of Xi Jinping as an authoritarian figure it seems to be associated with rising inequality within China, with the rich becoming richer. So he's using an anti-corruption campaign, an ideological campaign, etc., etc., to keep the public opinion on his side, because he has not been able to reduce the inequality in his own society.
In fact, one of the many flaws this regime has is its inability to accept that there is a problem, an economic problem, whether it's unemployment, whether it's rising prices. It doesn't even release the data. It hit the data when the last data was released by, I think, Life Mint, and it disowned the data, and there has not been a report released since the last 8 years. So given that, what role do you think the public intellectuals in particular play in furthering this narrative? Because you see people in the Economic Advisory Council, people like maybe Sanjeev Sanyal, uh, or Samika Ravi, talk about the fact that India is actually doing very well economically and everything is fine.
Well, I mean, I don't blame people who are in government trying to defend the government. That's their job. They're doing their job. So if you're a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, you have to find arguments to show that the bosses are doing all right. So let them do their job. But I think the real issue in India is the quality of data. And I think the government has finally acknowledged this by appointing some kind of an expert committee, under the chairmanship of a former statistician, Pranab Sen, to look into the quality of data. But I think the real scandal in India is the fact that the decennial census has been postponed. And many other data sets have not been updated. I think that the issue there really is one of organizational reform, of putting together data in a cost-effective manner, and so on. But we now have a large number of individual researchers and conducting a lot of sample surveys. The Center for Monitoring Indian Economy is one such. So we have information. Now, a lot of the information does question this official narrative, but a lot of the information, a lot of the official information, actually is also critical of what is happening. I mean, you take, for example, the data on industrialization, Make in India. Make in India is not taking off. Share of manufacturing in national income has not increased. The government has tried various things in order to stimulate private investment, but private investment is not picking up. The growth in total overall investment in the industrial economy over the last decade has been essentially public investment. And I keep joking that Narendra Modi is a closet Nehruvian, because if you see his foreign policy, the outreach to the global south, in the run-up to the G20 and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and if you see his dependence on public investment, these were the two pillars of Jawaharlal Nehru, non-alignment and public sector. Of course, today it's not non-alignment; it's called multi-alignment. So there's a little, non-alignment was a little tilt towards the Soviets. Under multi-alignment, there's a little tilt towards the Americans. But the point really is that we try to be independent in our foreign policy, which was Nehru's basic argument. And then depend on the public sector for sustaining economic growth, which again what Nehru and Indira Gandhi tried. So there are real challenges on the ground, which even if you manipulate the data, you cannot hide, because it's there in front of you, what is happening in the manufacturing sector.
And self-reliance is also straight out of Indira Gandhi's playbook.
Exactly. I mean, I've written an essay, in fact, for an RSS publication. I was approached by a friend who's in the RSS, Ashwini Mahajan, who is the convener for the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, which is the self-reliance forum of the RSS. And he invited me to write an essay on, Make in India, which is the flagship program of Manmohan Singh. And I said to him, I'll certainly write, but you'll have to publish what I write. And, granted to him, he's agreed to publish what I write. And the book is going to soon come out with a foreword by Mr. Mohan Bhagwat, who is the leader of the RSS. But my essay in that book says that this so-called Atmanirbharta and Make in India is nothing but going back to the foundations of what Jawaharlal Nehru tried to do, and the policy framework for this was provided in what was called the Bombay Plan, originally written by J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Indian business, and therefore we are once again looking at the government as the source of investment, as the state as the provider of investment and the motivator for economic development. So this takes us back, and that's because of the failure of the private sector. And if you look at the 2022 budget speech, February 2022, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman actually has a sentence there, which reads straight out of something written by Mahalanobis in the 1950s, and I've written about that.
But there does seem to be slight contradiction between, say, the RSS, Swadeshi Jagran Manch, and the BJP's economic policies in the sense that consider, for instance, S. Gurumurthy writing about Ambani and critiquing Ambani and crony capitalism and all of that. All of that is back with this government.
Well, India is a very complicated country. Joan Robinson, the Cambridge economist, once very famously said that every statement on India and its opposite is true. So, in some ways, even the BJP, which is a very ideological oriented party like the Communist Party, has internal contradictions. So you'll have an S. Gurmurthy, who has been a lifelong Ambani hunter. As you know, he was one of Ramnath Goenka's men. They went out of Dhirubhai Ambani, and they were known to be close to the corporate rivals of the Ambanis. And he continues that agenda. But the fact is that there are pro-Ambani elements, the anti-Ambani elements, the pro-Adani elements, the anti-Adani elements, like in all political parties. So I don't think one should take those contradictions very seriously. But I think the more interesting contradiction is the ideological contradiction. So, and that's true even in the Congress. I mean, the Congress party, when Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh were doing the liberalization program, was being criticized by people from within the Congress party. I mentioned Arjun Singh, N.D. Tiwari, of course, Mani Shankaraya. There were a lot of left of center people in the Congress party. So similarly, today in the BJP, there's a lot of criticism from within the BJP of some of the things that Modi is doing. I think the only difference is that when Narasimha Rao did something, every member of the Congress party had the guts to speak up. Today, when Modi is doing something, nobody in the BJP has the guts to speak up. They don't publicly criticize it. But if you talk to some of them, you know that there are a lot of people who are not too happy with a lot of what he's doing. For example, this outright tilt towards Gautam Adani and favoring his businesses. There are a lot of people in the BJP are very uncomfortable with this. But they will not come out as openly and critically as they used to in the Congress system.
Do you think the collusion, if there exists a collusion between big business and this government, is it an outlier or has it always been the case?
Collusion between big business and politics in India has always been there. And that's why I have a chapter on business in my book, India's Power Elite. It's in the nature of capitalism. It's in the nature of the society that the politically and economically powerful come together. The interesting thing in India, as I pointed out in my book, is that the politically powerful have become economically powerful using political power. And the economically powerful are becoming powerful using their economic power. So you have, let's take the most obvious example of a Modi sitting in Gujarat who is able to make the transition to Delhi with the financial support of a businessman. It's not first time, it won't be the last time. One can give similar examples from other parts of the country and other parties. And then you have Adani, who is a businessman who uses his access to a politician to strengthen his own business base. And again, not a unique example. There are any number of such businessmen. So this collusion between politics and business, which earlier, there's a set of politicians, there are a set of businessmen, and the politicians needed the money of the businessman needed the political support of the politician. There are two different groups, social groups, but they needed each other. That has changed today, with the two groups increasingly socially coalescing. So some of the wealthiest Indians are members of parliament. Many of them businessmen. They use their position in politics, not just access to politics, but they use their position in politics to promote the business interests, right? So I think this collusion has become far more, and that's what I try to capture in my book.
Is it a few businessmen or is it at the expense of other businesses as well?
Well, some of these things would naturally be at the expense of others, because if there's a certain given space and one person is increasing his, space within that, somebody else is losing out. course, if the overall cake is growing, then everybody can benefit. But if the cake is not growing fast enough and somebody's business is growing faster than others, then you can see, I mean, you take a classic example like the ownership of the Bombay airport, which was set up by the GVK Reddy family. And Mr. Adani has used his influence to get control of that airport, right? So one business group has lost out, another business group has won. So, there is some of that direct, losers and winners. But I think the larger issue is across the country, at different levels, access to political power has benefited specific individuals. It's not just at the national level. I mean, long back, I wrote an essay. In fact, in 1990, I published an essay in a book edited by Francine Frankel, Rajiv Bhargav, Balbir Arora, etc., on regional business and regional capitalism in India, where I give the example of my own state of Andhra Pradesh, showing how the emergence of regional business, for example, the Kamma capitalists contributed to the rise of N.T. Ramarao, a Kamma political leadership. And so, that direct link between the rise of the Kamma community, which is like the Jats of Andhra in politics, and their rise in business. You see a parallel movement in Andhra Pradesh, and one can think of similar examples from across the country. So they may not be big at the national level. They're certainly not the Ambanis and the Adanis, but there are the Reddys and the Raos and the Rajus, etc., and the Chettiars and the Patels and various other business communities across the country who have used their access to power. I mean, UP today, there are lots of business groups that have benefited from their access to Yogi Adityanath, not just to the BJP, but to the man in power in that particular state.
You're right about this, and you also mentioned how in some states the battle is actually between two businessmen to become chief ministers, particularly in the case of Andhra Pradesh. But one thing that struck me in your chapter on public intellectuals is the fact that we give so little importance to our scientists. Our scientists, our professionals don't become celebrity figures. They're celebrated when something like Chandrayaan-3 happens, but then we forget about it. Abdul Kalam being a rare exception. Why do you think that is the case?
Oh, I think there's a lot of anti-intellectualism within the elite. And I know this goes back a long way. I mean, again, here, there was a brief period during Nehru's time when, scientists and economists and academics were celebrated. But over time, that celebration has gone down. But forget about politicians and prime ministers. Look at businessmen. I was very briefly Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce. And during my brief stay there, I tried to get the organization to stop referring to ministers as honorable minister. It's a very simple reform. I said, why do we call a minister honorable minister? We don't call a scientist honorable scientist. We don't call a professor honorable professor. So why are we calling only politicians in power honorable? Let us stop using this. I tried to do it, but to no avail. Even today, you go to any function in Delhi, if there's a minister on the dais, is invariably referred to as honorable minister. I mean, in the US, we refer to the president as Mr. President. Or in Britain, the prime minister is referred to as Mr. Prime Minister. But in India, it's honorable, very honorable, highly esteemed. I mean, we use all these prefixes in order to elevate the status of politicians. But we never use any such prefix to elevate the status of a scientist, of an author, of a scholar, of a philosopher, of a writer. So I think there is a very peculiar kind of anti-intellectualism that is pervasive within the elite, particularly the political and the business elite. And this is quite repulsive. I mean, I find myself being invited to give lectures to businessmen, and when I ask them, what will you pay? They're surprised at the question. But no businessman would spend 1 minute of his day to do anything unless he's getting something out of it, right? So they believe in the profit principle, in the market, the laws of the market. But when it comes to intellectual property, and asking for advice or asking for someone to share their view, they are not concerned. So there is a lot of that kind of anti-intellectualism.
And that has seeped into media as well, because when you see journalists interview ministers, they would also refer to them as honorable ministers. This was not always the case. This was not even the case in 2014. You could see someone like as virulent as Arnab Goswami would not do that. But today he does that. Today he pampers and there's sycophancy and all of that. So, but with journalists particularly, given the fact that the Prime Minister does not particularly care about journalists, but the journalist seems to fawn over him. So, what do you think is the source of the complacency and sycophancy of the media when the faces really have not changed? India today is still run by Arun Puri. So, what's the cause for this?
Well, I think there it would be unfair to only criticize or attribute this to Mr. Narendra Modi. Sycophancy in the media goes back a long, long way. Obsequiousness of editors goes a long, long way. I mean, India Today itself is a classic example, and I think I mentioned that in this book.
Yes.
That it was launched in the middle of the emergency to defend the emergency. The very first issue of the India Today, the first few issues of the India Today, carried editorials and articles in defense of the emergency, right? So these were the guys who were the groupies of Rajiv Gandhi, Doon School, St. Stephen. This crowd was very much obsequious. They're part of the elite in the past, and now there are others who are part of the elite. I think the only difference is that in the past, for every Arun Puri who would defend the emergency, there would be an Arun Shauri opposing the emergency. And I think that was the thing about India in the past, that opposition voices did exist and did have power. I mean, Arun Shauri was editor of the Indian Express, right? So today that is much less. And I have often thought that part of it may be because of pressure from the government. But I think certainly a part of it is also self-censorship on the part of those in the media who are always have this tendency to, to cater to those in power.
One thing that surprises me, which you also mentioned, is the fact that political differences don't seem to matter as much. So, someone like Pratap Bhanu Mehta is considered to be in the same league as Romila Thapar, notwithstanding their political differences and differences in interpretations. So, who is the new elite? What is the ideology? Is there an ideology of the new elite? And uh, what have they been replaced by?
Well, first of all, I think there is an emerging new elite, and their ideology is very clear. It's Hindutva, that India is essentially a Hindu nation. Other religions have a place in India. Only the extreme right-wing Hindutva crowd, the Bajrang Dal types and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, may take a view that other religions have no place in India. But that's not the majority view. The majority view would be, of course, they have a place in India, but their place status is second. But basically, we are a Hindu nation. That is the ideology of this new elite. And it is put across in a non-aggressive manner. Unlike the extreme elements who would say you have to kill the Hindus or the Muslims, there's a lot of violence in their way of looking at minorities. But the large majority, there may not be violence, but certainly I think there is an assertion of majoritarianism. But on the question of who constitutes, etc., I mean, this is 10 years is not a long time. They are in the process of being formed. People enter, exit, and a lot of that is happening. You do see in the management of the media, you do see in the management of universities, academic institutions, very deliberate. I mean, for example, anything to do with India's hosting of the G20 is all been reposited in the hands of those who are with this government, ideologically with this government. Anyone who's critical of the current regime in Delhi has not had any involvement in anything to do with the run-up to the G20. So
But
we've had
any government
conference
would
of,
do that, really.
no, any government would do that, not on an ideological basis. They may say that, you support the government's agenda on foreign policy or economic policy, you're with us. But here it's not just on supporting economic policy or foreign policy. It is supporting the ideology of the Prime Minister. Are you pro-Modi, not pro-Modi? So you cannot be critical of the Prime Minister and yet be associated with any institution. I mean, I have this example in my book, earlier book, Accidental Prime Minister, Mani Shankar Iyer, who was a critique of Dr. Manmohan Singh, who criticized the nuclear deal, was a member of the Union Council of Ministers. And, I mean, that was the whole Congress. You had people who disagreed with the boss, but who are very much part of the circle of power. That no longer happens. There is, and if even minor disagreement, you're kind of ostracized. The whole world is told that this guy is out of favor. So there is that kind of high partisanship. I think the word to use is there's a high level of partisanship in the way in which various individuals in media, in academia, in business are treated. A businessman who criticize the government, who question the government, are subject to all manner of threats or disadvantages. I think the last businessman who publicly said anything against this government was Rahul Bajaj, and he of course had the stature to do that. But how many across the country would have the courage to be a Rahul Bajaj today?
So, given that the Overton window seems to be shifted to the Hindu right, do you think that the only way to fight the BJP is perhaps to be Hindu, but in a less overt way?
No, I think the real issue is to restore the supremacy of the democratic process, to assert individuals, um, individual rights. That it is not what your religion is that should decide what you do when you cast your vote, but what your range of other interests are. I mean, religion could well be a factor that defines my electoral choice, but it cannot be the only factor. And therefore, the pursuit of the intelligent citizen, the building of intelligent citizenship, which is a long-term process, but that's the only way in which liberalism can survive. I mean, after all democratic societies are struggling with this all the time. It's not just India. I mean, you look at United States, 200 years of democracy, right? And yet today, the biggest problem in the United States is to defend democratic principles, So
Yes.
So, even in the United States, I mean, you're defending basic democratic principles at a time when, US is a 200-year-old democracy. So I think there is a struggle for the assertion of the values of individual rights, civil liberties, which is something that democracies have to constantly wage.
Dr. Baru, I enjoyed having this conversation with you. I learned a lot, and I would highly recommend our viewers to buy this book. It's a terrific book, highly recommended. Did you enjoy having this conversation with me?
Thank you. Yes, I did. I mean, always enjoy chatting with you, and thank you for this conversation. And I hope more people would be, enthused to read the book after listening to our conversation.
Yes. All right. Have a great day. Like, share, and subscribe.